Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the International Community for the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm Steven Goodman, and I'm here to lead this discussion about Afghanistan. And we have two terrific guests today, Khushood Nabizad, who is from Afghanistan, and Cami Rice, who's American, who's been actively involved in helping people from Afghanistan come to the United States. In the background is Dan Kabisky, who runs the International Community for the SPJ, and he's going to be monitoring the chat if anybody has any questions or any comments. So please go ahead and throw them in there. Khushood, if we can start with you, if you could say a word or two. You ran a press back in Afghanistan before you were evacuated to come to the United States. Could you say a word or two about that press and what it did, what it does, and what you're hoping to do with that press going forward?
Thank you very much, Steve. First of all, today, as a World Press Freedom Day, I send my gratitudes and good wishes to all journalists around the world and to the families of those who have given sacrifices and to those who have lost their lives for supporting freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and in support working in this way. Me as a journalist and as someone who have been supporting freedom of speech, freedom of expression, almost all parts of my life, that I have been a matcher since 2010, when I was a student at the university back in Afghanistan. I felt that there is a need of working further in journalism and in supporting democracy with journalism and writing. I established Hama Press. Let me just explain that what does Hama means. Hama means pen. It's a very ancient word in Persian. So yeah, being a student and starting working for such a big cause, it was not easy. But I worked day and night, and I put a lot of my efforts and time to run it. And we slowly be growing to one of the largest online news service in Afghanistan. Recruited a lot of journalists, including both men and women. But very unfortunately, August last year, all achievements of Afghanistan, including press freedom, they were all destroyed, and some are still existing as still Hama Press is operating on site, but they are in a very bad situation, and it really I'm not sure how long further it can go.
Well, we all followed, obviously, the news of the tragic news of the Taliban taking over Afghanistan. But what did you do since then? What have you done since then in terms of trying to keep the press alive?
Well, let me just tell the audience that on August 15, when Afghanistan's administration collapsed, me as a journalist, I was at risk, and I was helped by the U.S. Department of State to get out of the country. I got out of the country on the 19th, but in the meantime, what I did, I tried to support my staff and my journalists online, collaborating with them and talking to them on a regular basis. They got obviously run out of funds, and what I did, I sold out all my properties back in Afghanistan and paid the office rent and their salaries until now. I also launched an online fundraiser to collect some funds and money from our audience and friends and networks. It really didn't go well because maybe well, the thing is that it was also very complicated. The GoFundMe, the most famous fundraising website, they stopped our fundraiser because of the Taliban. They said that we cannot do this operation, we cannot launch it because it was under some sort of sanctions by the U.S. government. So it didn't go well. What else I did? I registered a non-profit organization trying to support Home Press, not only Home Press, but journalism and blogging and writing in Afghanistan and in South Asian countries. Yeah, these were what I did after August 2021.
Well, fair enough, and I think we're going to want to hear a lot more about that. But if we can turn to Cami for a second. Cami, you're American, but somehow you're involved in these efforts on the ground. Can you explain a word or two about what you're doing and how you got involved?
Yeah, so I'm a freelance journalist. That's my real job. But in August, I had spent Christmas 2019 in Kabul with some NGO friends. And so that's connected me to the country. I did a security training before I went, and the media security agency that led that training reached out to me August 15th that week and asked if I knew any journalists who needed seats on a Reuters flight out of Afghanistan. And that began work that I'm still doing 9 months later. So that simple question. A team that it was all very ad hoc. A lot of us, I was coordinating with journalists, other media organizations that do security, military folks, other civilians, volunteers all over the world who are all coordinating and became this huge network of people volunteering to work to come alongside Afghans, really as a team. You know, we were all working together, scrambling to try to do what it felt like our governments weren't doing very well at the time. So many people have had to go back to their regular jobs. I've been able to kind of keep doing this work in concert with my regular work.
But we learned and we know that there was this crazy situation at the airport in Kabul. How are you helping people who now don't want to admit that they were ever working with the Americans?
Yeah, it's a lot of WhatsApp, and then it became Signal, chats, emails, phone calls. Really what it took to get initially the kind of operations that were in effect that have been fairly widely reported on. People might have been on lists for evacuation flights, but then they couldn't get into the airport because there were so many masses of people and the security situation was so dire. So many of us who had success had that in helping people get into the airport for their flights, had that only because of connections with various military folks who are on the ground. So we were coordinating all that through, from our houses, wherever we were. For me, it was in Europe, and managing. So we were not on the ground physically, but for most of us, but it certainly felt like we were living there alongside the people who were. And so we're coordinating that through Signal.
And Khushood, how are you communicating with the people back in Afghanistan who want to come to the United States now? And how are you doing that in a way that isn't putting them at risk?
Well, it's mostly my staff and people who work with me in journalism. I'm communicating with them through some. One of the means is the Signal that's said to be one of the safest channels to talk online, and that's the main source of communication we do. And of course, it's really sensitive, and people back in Afghanistan, they cannot dare to talk to people abroad because they are really under check, and their calls and numbers are being tracked by the government.
But let's say, we're doing this for the Society of Professional Journalists, which is a major organization in the United States. What do you want SPJ members to do to help you reach out to your former colleagues who may not have worked for your press, but former colleagues in Afghanistan more broadly?
Well, the fact, to speak very frankly, we do not have very serious issue with communicating with them at the moment. Somehow we pass our messages to each other, to both sides. But the thing is that from the journalism community, what we need is to support their applications further with the governments and with the international agencies that support, that they are willing to help their cases in order so they can get out of Afghanistan, because many of them are living in a very bad situations. They cannot appear in public. They are not in their home. Some are there in their friends' houses, and some live in neighboring countries, away from their families. They cannot even support their own family, kids, wife, and children. So I think that's the main area that we need help. Journalists need help.
Yeah,
and I would.
Yeah, I'm nodding my head so much. I think that one of the big challenges that we as volunteers have found is that there's only so much we can do before we run into the things that only governments can do. Volunteers can be very well intended, but the reality is people have to cross borders and have documents, and there's diplomacy that makes a difference for what's possible. And the world has moved on to Ukraine, the Ukraine crisis, which is a legitimately huge, serious crisis, but Afghanistan is not solved. And there are people in extreme danger still in Afghanistan. And it's, I think, coverage of the situation is one of the things that other journalists can do to raise awareness for the journalists who are still there, why the danger exists, that they exist. It's challenging because the people who are there have to be so security conscious. So there are a lot of details of their situations that they're not at liberty to share. And even journalists who are out, they still have family members who are back and who would face reprisals if they're very public. And so and that's the same reason the diplomacy is complicated as well for the governments working on this. But continuing to keep Afghanistan and the reality for journalists in Afghanistan who have not exited in the news is important. I think another challenge that maybe Khushood can speak to is as all the journalists leave the country or have to be in hiding, getting good information from the country is going to become more difficult, is becoming more difficult. The same reason that intelligence for the military is also more difficult, because we don't have eyes and ears on the ground the way we used to. So I don't know, Khushood, if you can even speak to how can we still get good information from Afghanistan with the challenges there are for journalists to work there right now?
Well, the reality on the ground is that there is let's distinguish between the local journalists and the international news agencies operating there, like New York Times and Washington Post and some other big international news agencies. The Taliban, the spirit of Taliban, it's against democracy, against journalism, and against freedom of expression. The situation for the journalists will get even worse than this. If, God forbid, the Taliban administration is recognized by the world, so that the second day you will see no journalists, no news agencies operating. Well, now they are very good with big agencies like BBC, New York Times, and Washington Post, because they know that they are important and they are still waiting and to get recognized. But the local journalists, they are being detained, they are being tortured, and well, they cannot. It's very difficult. So they cannot operate. But yes, what will happen if the journalists get out and there's nobody to report on site? Well, the answer to this question, I think that the situation will be something like now, because now it is the people journalism. It's everyone with a smartphone and everyone's access to social media. That's the only source of information now. No individual can independently report from Afghanistan, especially local journalists. And I re-emphasize that the situation can get worse, much worse for journalists than today.
And what would you do then to prevent that from happening, from getting worse?
Well, to go on a political aspect, we need the international society needs first not to forget Afghanistan. Well, of course there is Ukraine crisis, very hot, but at the same time, parallelly, Afghanistan is in a very worse situation, humanitarian crisis there. So if the international community put pressure on the Afghanistan Taliban administration to force somehow to put them in a situation to accept certain things of democratic values, including freedom of expression and journalism. I think that could be the only way to support journalism and freedom of expression in Afghanistan. Otherwise, Taliban with their current status and they will not accept and they will not allow journalism in Afghanistan.
What do you think about the argument that Cami made a moment ago about the world having moved on to Ukraine, and obviously the Ukraine situation is very dire. Do you agree with her assessment that has affected the attention span of people who perhaps had been focused on Afghanistan?
Well, you see that moving of attentions toward Ukraine and forgetting Afghanistan will bring a new homework for the world, very tough than before. You see the extremism and terrorism is growing in the Afghanistan, South Asia, and slowly into the Central Asia. This will, of course, affect the region and slowly to the world. You see on political aspect, you see it's Iran, Russia, China, Pakistan, and Taliban. Somehow I see a consensus between these five groups, like five names. If the international community, especially the West, forgets Afghanistan, Afghanistan will become a dangerous headache for the world, and that will be a school of terrorism and extremism that will threaten the world in a very badly, like even unbelievably. It's very dangerous.
I think that.
And Cami, one, do you agree with that? And then two, could you say a word or two about your role as an individual? Because you don't really represent the US government. So it's kind of interesting that you're involved in the way you are. And I wonder if this is a path that other freelancers or other journalists could get involved without necessarily working for the State Department or for the Washington Post or the New York Times.
Yeah, first, just to say, I think that what Khushood mentioned is important. Just as journalists, and we, especially those of us who work the international beat, for us, we care about the world. We care about things happening in other parts of the world, but our audiences don't always, and they don't always understand why it matters. And I think COVID has maybe taught us, if we will let it, a little bit more about how global and interconnected the world is. But the reality is that what's happening in Afghanistan matters in America. So this idea of let's not be the policeman of the world is a way of actually dismissing an issue, an inaccurate representation of what's going on. So I think that as journalists, it's partly our job to educate people why what's happening in Afghanistan doesn't just stay in Afghanistan, that it matters. And obviously that's true anywhere else. And we're a global society. And so what's happening in America affects other places in the same way. We are connected to each other, whether we want to be or not. As far as the work, I think it's been fascinating. I mean, in part to have conversations with Afghans these last 9 months, and to feel that our government made promises to particular Afghans, I think Afghans in general, but also especially in the military context, and to people building civil society, that we won't leave you behind. There was a sense of promise. And I think certainly the sense is that our government doesn't necessarily have a great track record of standing by those types of promises in places that we intervene. And certainly in this experience, and that's why the veterans and so many people who worked in Afghanistan have been very involved in these evacuation efforts. And I'm not a veteran, but there is a sense I am an American, and I'm someone who believes that you uphold your promises. And so there's one aspect of my involvement is a sense that, hey, I've ended up in a position where as an American, I can do what I can to try to uphold the promises my country made to people, make good on them. And that's still America holding up its promises. Me as a citizen. And I guess just say living in France where I live, like I've learned too, like as an American, we're always involved in diplomacy. You're always representing your country wherever you go. So even though it's not my job to work for the State Department, I am a representative of America. But I think another thing I've learned is just working with military folks who are used to working in security environments and having certain skills and checking out information. It's been fun, I guess, if you could, to find them surprised by the skills that journalists have that are actually just as good or relevant to what intelligence community the skills they have to have. Like we're used to vetting sources. So learning what information to trust and all those kind of things that were skills that were very much handy in what was sort of a military operation that I was involved in at the beginning. It's become more of like a consular affairs operation now, caseworking in essence, working much slower, different kind of situation than the early days of the evacuation. So there are skills, the skills are transferable. And as journalists, as freelancers, we can get around and we have to follow laws, but there are limitations that we don't have because we don't have an employer. And I've actually found that exciting and freeing to find that there are things I've learned along the way, how to network and build this network that really came in handy. Like so often with the team I'm working with, I'd be like, oh, I know someone there, or I have a contact there, or I know someone who knows someone there. And we're used to following the trail to get the information. And that was a really valuable skill in working these last 9 months.
Well, that's interesting. Can I ask the audience if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask, if you can just throw that into either the chat or the Q&A box, and then we'll ask them of our panelists. This would be a great time. If you have a question, feel free to do that. And while we wait for some of those, Cami, if I can just get back to this point a little bit more, I know somebody is thinking this right now and they don't want to be impolite, but are you in danger? How dangerous is this project? You have an American accent. How are you in danger?
I don't think so. I've had to answer that question to my mother these last 9 months a few times. I've been working this obviously from safe places. And so it is sobering to one of the first journalists that I spoke with the first week that Kabul fell was an Afghan. I had to call him to ask him some questions. It was my first call to Afghanistan that week. And I think he called me actually. And so I answered the phone and he's like, we're like, how are you? And he asked me how I am, which, that's a normal way to start a conversation, but it felt very absurd for me to return the question to him, knowing that he was burning documents so that the Taliban couldn't find them and preparing to run for his life with his family. It felt really rude to be like, oh, so how are you? But I also learned that there was a humanity in asking that question, and that it's great. At least the Afghans I interact with, that's how we start every text conversation. And it was fun to learn that part of the Afghan culture from the beginning. I mean, we do that in America, but we also like to cut to the chase when there's business. We just send a text and ask the question. So it's a surreal thing to work with people who are physically in danger and know that I'm really close to what's going on. We were working this 24/7 the week of the evacuation, and I would be up late. There was one night we were getting pictures from Abbey Gate of what it looked like there, and it was real-time pictures, and it was daylight. And I texted one of my teammates. I'm like, this is really strange because in my Afghanistan, it's still dark outside. That's how much it felt like we were there. Was that there was a helicopter that flew over my house late one night, which happens occasionally, not often. It was low. And there was a moment where I paused and had to remember I was not in a war zone, that I didn't really need to worry about that helicopter. But yeah, I have not been in danger. And it's, right now the Taliban the reality is they're a domestic organization. And so that's a little bit different than other groups that you could end up dealing with that have a wider reach that would cause more problems potentially.
Thank you. And maybe if we can get to the opposite of that, Khushood, if you could say a word or two, what's it like to be in the United States, where some people who you're interacting with really may not completely understand how dire the situation was in Afghanistan? Yes, they saw the news coverage, but they don't completely understand that. They're going to go to the grocery store, they want to get some milk for their kids, and they interact with you. How are those interactions going?
Well, each time I speak to people back in Kabul, either they are my families or my current colleagues or my former colleagues. Basically, most of them are journalists. Well, it really gives me a very negative and bad feeling, thinking that I'm somewhere safe. And I'm not worried about anything, but I'm speaking to the opposite side that is in danger and thinks that in each minute or any time he or she can be targeted or can be detained or can be taken. So basically, it gives me a very inconvenience thinking about them, but when talking to them, it really puts me under a lot of pressure, thinking about their tough situation. What I would like to raise later, if we had time, is that there are a lot of real journalists now on the ground living hiddenly in Afghanistan or in places like Pakistan or Iran, but other people have got out of the country that they were not, they were families of some journalists, or they were not real journalists. This is one of the, actually, this is the concerns of myself and hundreds of other journalists, that this voice should be raised and they should be supported and helped.
And if journalists from around the world, whether they're in Iran or somewhere else, if they are able to watch this session that we're doing, it sounds like you're almost putting out a call to run some sort of underground railroad to help journalists around the world who are in danger. If that's so, do you want, one, is that so? And two, do you want people to reach out to you? And do you have the network and the ability to assist those journalists?
Are you asking Khushood?
Well, at first, but I was going to ask you as well. So whichever one of you would like to jump in.
I mean, at this point, I would say my team and I are like some of the folks working this Afghanistan crisis have switched gears to working Ukraine or are doing both. My team is very small, so right now we're not in a position to do what you're asking about. I would say that we're learning a lot of things, and we never know how those will be applied in the future. And certainly, I think one other thing to add to one of your previous questions is that I think countries that advocate press freedom, and World Press Freedom Day is a great day to acknowledge that, need to stand behind that by supporting journalists who need a safe place to go. It's great to give words to press freedom in a country that has press freedom, and to be like, we're so appreciative of these journalists in countries that don't have that. But when it's time for them to flee, they need places to go. And there need to be countries that have, I mean, let's get visas specifically for endangered journalists or something. Like there are Afghan journalists who can't come to the US unless they worked for a US entity, which I'm sure Khushood is under, you know the details of that. It's really complicated. And that would be another way for countries to support the idea of press freedom, is when somebody needs to flee, that there is a visa they can apply for in that instance, in that situation.
Hello, Steve. Sorry, I lost you in the last minutes. I think it's my bad internet here. I don't know why. Well, I do agree with Kami. Well, actually, Afghanistan is now in a position that all the achievements of the last 20 years of democracy have gone and have been lost. We are trying to save journalists and women's rights activists, human rights activists in general, and people who work with the international community. So one of the groups that they really need help, and they are being killed or tortured and detained on a daily basis, and there is no report out of it, and there's no coverage. It's journalists. And today, marking the World Press Freedom Day, we are raising voice. We are talking to let those who are claiming to be the supporters of freedom of expression, and to those who are claiming to support journalists in Afghanistan in this bad time, that they should hear this, that they really need help. And today, me as a journalist and as a representative to those who are not here today, but I just pass the message that let's support them, and let's save their lives now. They need to be saved.
But how can those lives be saved if they're still in Afghanistan? So my understanding is they have to somehow leave Afghanistan, whether it's to come to the United States or to come to France or to come to Norway or Sweden or somewhere. How does that happen? Or how should it happen?
Well, yes, Steve, you're right. I say that everything, I say that the achievements of last 20 years have been destroyed and have been lost. So we are trying to save individuals, people's life. So we need to take them out. That's the only option now. Those who are at severe risk and they have evidence, they should be supported. In any country that's safe, like Asian countries, if possible, not European countries, Northern America, but they are in need of help.
And maybe just to give more practical specifics to your question, Steve, in order to get out, anyone who leaves the country needs to have a passport. And that alone has not been a prospect. The last 9 months, at various times, the passport offices have been completely closed. Other times you have to go through intermediaries to get them, and that's very costly. And then at this point, there are a few commercial flights out of Afghanistan, but you're going to have to, Afghans are not like Americans. We can travel almost anywhere in the world without a visa. Afghans don't have that luxury. So they have to have a visa to any country, like just a tourist visa or to go anywhere. Then the neighboring countries have very strict rules, unlike the Ukrainians whose neighbors have thankfully been welcoming to them. Afghanistan's neighbors, by and large, have not been able to roll out the red carpet in that way. So you have to get a visa to the neighboring countries, most of whom are not giving visas or very few. And getting those visas can be extremely pricey. Once you get to the neighboring country, you would have to have a visa interview at an embassy because many of the embassies in Afghanistan are closed. So even if you have a visa application to go to another country, you have to get to a neighboring country in order to go to that country's embassy to finish the process. And then you have to be able to support yourself in that neighboring country when you don't have a job. Most of the time, you're unable to work because the economy has gone away, and you have to support yourself for any number of months. Like I couldn't afford to support myself without working for a lot of months in another place. And that's what's necessary. And then you have to have a country that will take the journalists and get you on a list and go through a long process. And it's incredibly complicated and really, really challenging. And sometimes it comes down to who you know. Like a lot of these last months we've been working this, it's like you just find that the one relationship, things are getting more organized as time has gone on, though it feels like it's been way too late for many people. But it's a really complex, it's hard to capture how complicated it is to get the opportunity to go somewhere.
Well, we appreciate you explaining the complexity, and so we don't end this on a doom and gloom note. So since this is complex, I think it would be helpful before we close today to mention, so specifically, what would you like the journalists from the SPJ or other international organizations to do right now? What's the takeaway? What do you want them to do right now when they see this clip? How do you want them to contact you? Do you want them to call you? Do you want them to email you? How do you want them to contact you? And maybe if each of you could just say what specifically you would like, how you would like people to reach out to you, that would be a good way to close this discussion. Because really what I hear you both asking is that you need assistance. And what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is share the assistance you would specifically like, and let's hope that people can answer that call.
I guess I'll start, and then Khushood, you can take it over. So I'm trying to think. So my team is Allied Shepherd, Allied shepherd.org. You're welcome to look us up. You can contact me through the website, the web form on that website. We are taking donations that help us provide some of that emergency food and housing assistance that I mentioned is necessary at times. We also, I think we have it on our website. We do have a campaign that one of the people we're working with, he had plans to, he's a mountaineer. He had plans to climb K2 in Pakistan that appeared to be derailed by the change of government in Afghanistan, but he is going forward with that expedition in order to give hope to the mountaineering community in Afghanistan that good things still come from Afghanistan and it is not a place only of war. So we will get that link out to that GoFundMe campaign that we're spreading the word about. And I would just say, if you need sources for stories, I would imagine Khushood is available as well. I'll let him answer if he is, but I'm glad to help out, and let's keep this in the news and let the story is not over. Let the world not forget about the journalists in Afghanistan and all the others who are still suffering desperately.
Thank you. Kami, yes, I do agree with Kami. What I think me or people like me, some journalists that are active to help people back in Afghanistan, the journalists, well, they can reach out to me. Well, I have a LinkedIn profile and also I'm on Twitter. What we really want to do is to raise the voices of those people back in Afghanistan. If they need to connect with people there, I can be of help. Or if they need certain sources of stories, I can help them. I have still an active team back in Afghanistan that they can connect me with other people. And I can be help of assistance in that part. Yeah, and I think that's it.
Well, that is incredible. So thank you both so much for your time today. I think this is a really interesting conversation. You know, obviously people who don't follow Afghanistan every day remember that, you know, that crazy scene at the airport. I actually remembered focusing on Afghanistan quite a while ago. We actually did a segment about the American University of Afghanistan, and I know they are facing some of the same issues that we were talking about today. But I'd just like to say thank you both for doing that. And I'd also like to urge people who are interested in learning more about the Society of Professional Journalists to please feel free and reach out to Dan Kubisky, who runs the international group for the SPJ. So I'm going to say thank you. Have a good night, everybody. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and we really appreciate your time and interest in focusing on Afghanistan. So have a good night, everybody.